This particular model is one which shows where we are. It doesn't look like this. It's not inside a building. But it's useful for travel to or from Accra. Here's another model of the world. And this model is from the exact same underlying database and modeling software, which is Google Maps. So Google Maps has an underlying database and an underlying software that has given us these two models, which are very different. This is a model that's good for going from the airport to this hotel. And what would this model be useful for? Well, populating with data. You see the different colors. What do those different colors tell you? Traffic. Other users of this app have put it in their cars, in their telephone, and that tells Google how fast they're moving, so that you would know that if you left the airport at a certain time, what is the likely delay because of traffic? So different kinds of models allow you to capture different kinds of data, even though they're all doing violence to the world and from the same underlying world shown in different ways. And here's a different version. If you wanted to walk from here to the beach and so forth, this would tell you what the individual roads are called, and it could capture other kinds of prices, other things like prices, for example, such as the prices of ground nuts in the Google Maps that Daniel just showed you before. So any model is going to do violence to the world. It's going to be allow you to look at different aspects of the world depending on exactly what kind of data you bring into it. And the models that we're familiar with in agriculture, nutrition, health really begin with this one. This became the dominant conceptual framework, the model that people had in mind all through the 1990s about the determinants of child nutrition. The UNICEF framework was very, very popular. Okay, so here's another model, another flat version of the very complicated world that we're familiar with, causal pathways. Do you see which way these arrows go? Left to right. If I were a Hebrew speaker and made a causal pathways model, which way might I do it? From right to left, because we're used to thinking from left to right, and a causal pathways model is usually thought of in terms of the passage of time. So I would put agricultural production on the left and consumption on the right, because one harvests first and then eats later. Or you have the intervention where the funder has paid for a community health worker to do an activity, and then that would have some consequences for an outcome over here. So the real world, of course, is not anything like these. Here's a third kind of conceptual framework. System dynamics models. These date from the 1960s. And what you see here is recognizing that the world is really, in some sense, circular again, going from the bottom-up approach of UNICEF, the left-to-right approach of causal pathways, to a more circular sense. Now, here's the economist's model. It's none of those things. It's something different. It's something that in some measure is sort of harder to learn. It takes a learning lab like this to teach it. We'll explain what are all the elements of this. This is the individual households model. This is the community level outcome model. So if you've done one semester of economics, you're familiar with this. If you've done 3, you've already seen quite a lot of this. And we'll go in a measure of depth to get a sense of how these actually work. The point I want to make right from the start is that we capture nutrition in the red bits. We capture agriculture in the blue bits, and we capture markets and policy in the purple bits. Purple because it's a mix of blue and red, right? So what we're doing here is seeing the interaction of these 3 ways of dividing out the infinitely complicated world in a 2-dimensional space, because we have to put it on 2 dimensions to communicate. It's, of course, doing violence to the world. It's a simplification, just like all the other models are simplifications. And it's one particular one which is useful to get a job, because the money makes the world go around, because people go from engineering to economics, as Daniel's student did. And we'll see that it's important to get a job, that money makes the world go around, that people would go from engineering to economics for some very powerful reasons, because it works. It works to predict. It works to explain, and it works to evaluate. And governments have tens of thousands of paid economists to do that work of predicting and evaluating, because as an analytical framework, this provides us a set of theories with which to interpret observations and make inferences about cause and effect. Now, what you notice from these diagrams is that causality runs in all directions. People don't plant first and then eat. People plant because they ate. And they plant because they anticipate eating in the future. And so the future causes the present, and the present caused the past, just as much as the past causes. So time is not an identifying thing here in the sense of causality. Causality runs in all directions, and so we'll need randomized experiments to identify the effect of a new variety on outcomes. We'll need natural experiments like a fluctuation in rainfall to explain, to identify an effect of production on consumption and so forth. So this is the framework we'll be using. And this is a very old framework. The ideas that we're talking about in the next couple of hours really originate with these two books, Adam Smith in the late 18th century. Adam Smith developed economics out of philosophy, thinking about why people do what they do, the theory of moral sentiments, and then his much more famous book, The Wealth of Nations. These were arguments, these were fierce debates, and they were debates about food policy. They were debates about agriculture and even about nutrition, to the extent that people knew anything about nutrition at all. They were very concerned with the nutrition of poor people. And what Adam Smith did in developing both this theory of moral sentiments and the Wealth of Nations book was really try to displace the landowning aristocrats of England and Britain from their dominance in setting national policy. So he was arguing against trade restrictions that prevented French wheat from entering Britain. Those existed to protect the interests of British landowners, and he wanted to have ordinary British people have access to lower cost food. That was Adam Smith. And the modern form that we share today is due to this textbook that started in 1890. So it's been, of course, refined greatly since 1890. A lot of changes since then. But the diagrams that we'll be looking at that we just saw follow directly from Alfred Marshall's 1890. So what is this way of thinking about individual decisions? When we do economics about something, we start with very close observation of the thing itself. So if we're doing about agriculture for nutrition and health, we want to start with pictures like this. So these are farms I personally have visited. You yourself will have visited many, many others. What is it? It happens to be Ethiopia. Where else could you see a farm that looks like this? Any semi-arid region of the very, very low-income developing world, you would notice that there is no wattle or mud around this, so it's a pretty cold at night, hot in the daytime. It's not well insulated at all. It's very, very low cost. It would not last very long as a house. You can see pretty substantial field in this case, indicating that it's a large area. It's probably a pretty dry place for all of those reasons. You can see that there are cows here. Any guess on where this might be? Could be lots of places. Where would you have seen a farm like that? These happen to be dairy cows. These happen to be very, very valuable dairy cows. They happen to be in France. You might be able to see what crop this is. It happens to be soybeans. The RR stands for Roundup Ready. So these are a local seed company, this insignia. Where did the local seed company license the Roundup Ready trait from that they indicate with this name for this variety? So there's one company in the world that controls that trait, which was inserted into these seeds. This farm happens to be in Illinois, in the United States, in the Midwestern United States. You notice that you can't quite see it. The shape of their granary is not unlike the shape of any granary elsewhere. But these radically different sizes and types of farms and impoverished probably would be growing barley, perhaps wheat, perhaps a little bit of various leguminous grains, specialized dairy, and specialized corn and soybean in rotation, with very high-tech Roundup-ready seeds from Monsanto, but sold by this local seed company in Illinois. We want to just start with the observation of who are the individual decision makers here. Who are the individual people who are farmers in this setting, or any others? I could have taken dozens of photographs. After doing some close observation, we like to turn to data and think about what do we know from large-scale surveys, and the most important surveys are censuses. A census is when everyone is asked, and that's very important for a question like this one, because we want to ask every single farm in a country, how many people on this farm are a member of the family that owns and operates the farm versus a hired employee. And this is national censuses that are got together by the FAO, and the most recent sort of compendium of this was quite a while ago, and they're revamping this to try to have a new version of this. And if we can discuss to what degree the new version would look like this same result. So when each of these countries did a survey of every farm in their country, every single one, so not just a sample survey, but asking all of them, and asked people, how many of the people on this farm are members of the family, how many are hired workers? What I've done is to put on the x-axis the acreage, or hectares, the space of that farm, the area of that farm, in a log scale. So this is multiplying times 10 every time, and the reason for that is that farms vary in size hugely. From the tiniest farms that are half a hectare or so down here, to the largest that are several hundred. This is just the average of the country. Of course, each country has a wide range as well. You see some outliers. This is Senegal. The green is the family members. The red is the hired workers. What do you notice? That's astounding. Every single one of these is a family operation. It's mom, pop, and the kids, or just mom, or just the father, or and might leave it to just one child. So 1 to 3 family members working on each farm. And if I went to a 10,000 hectare wheat farm in Australia, or a half a hectare rice farm in South Korea, or a 500 hectare rice farm in Mississippi, or a 1 hectare rice farm in Mali, or a 2 hectare rice farm in Vietnam, it would still be the mother, the father, the children. There are some exceptions. So if we went to the far north of Ghana, if you went around to the Sahel, you would see other countries like Senegal. What's with that? Any of you have experience with families in the very semi-arid, especially the Sahel? So these would be not just many children, but also cousins and people who may not actually be blood relatives who would join the family compound and become members of that extended family. Because in those settings, you need to farm so much land, and you have agro-pastoral systems where you need to go herd many goats and cows, and that requires a lot of people, and people also stay together for security because they're very isolated in space. They're very far from their neighbors. So you see families that are very large, but they're still a family, even though they're kind of a synthetic family because they're chosen to be together as a family, but it's still family members. So we notice this fact as the beginning point of observation that was written about in great detail in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, and forms the bedrock underlying fact about agriculture, which remains true today, even in the highest tech agriculture, the most sophisticated with drones and GPS positioning for everything in your field, it's still a family operation. And there are some exceptions that we'll talk about in a moment. So here's a family that I photographed. These happen to be in Burkina Faso, and I asked the driver, please stop, 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 so I could take a picture, and then found the family because I was interested in what they were doing on the fields, and they posed very proudly to show what they had been doing. And the reason that we explain people being by themselves farming on their own is in terms of this fact. So I want to just pause on this for a second. This is how economists since the 1920s and 30s and 40s have explained why it's a family operation. What do you think of this explanation? Is this adequate to you? Begin to think about exceptions, situations in which this is not the case, that you do have hired workers on farms? Is this a good theory for why the FAO Census of Agriculture found the results we just saw? It's not only that it's difficult to observe and supervise, it's also difficult for these people to know, for that training to have happened. And so this little boy who's carrying the baby, he's learning all sorts of things. So this is a multi-generational family, and you could imagine this tremendous amount of learning. They're not just learning from their parents and grandparents, they're also getting essentially all of the capital on any farm comes from their parents and grandparents. This is not true for almost any other sector of the economy. Other sectors have bank loans, not agriculture. Agriculture gets bank loans only with government-sponsored credit, or a bank loan on equipment, which can be repossessed, and sometimes land, if there's secure land rights that can be repossessed. Otherwise, you have to rely on the savings of your grandparents and parents, because unlike other businesses, you can't get a loan. This is true even in the United States or Australia or rich country. It's about agriculture. It's not a fact of poor or rich country. Of course, we have lots of farm credit in the United States, but it's government-supported farm credit. There's also no outside investor. I can't buy a share in a neighboring farm. I can't. I can buy a share, a part of almost any other company. If I think transport is a good company or housing construction is a good company, I could buy a share in that. But I can't buy a share in farms. These farms that are families, they have to spread out over time. So in any given region where Ghanaians used to live, as their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren multiply, if they're successful and fortunate in controlling disease and having child survival, then there will be, and they have to spread out in space. So you could imagine going further and further to the north, to drier places, deeper into the forest, further up a hillside or a sandier soil, more difficult environment than people had farmed before. If the society gets rich, and we're about to see how Ghana has gotten to the stage of magnificent hotels like this one, relatively affluent country in Africa, able to have the extraordinary airport that we came into, and all of the street lights and other amenities of urban Accra, Ghana became quite prosperous for reasons we'll talk about in the course of the time. But people leave farming and move into salaried work, into employee work with bank loans and other investors. And the remaining farmers who stay behind, those farms can then take over the neighboring land, if that's possible. If the neighbor has left, they can farm that land. And as a result, they gain a larger area of land. They may also have improved seeds, also have improved water, pest control, soil fertility management, and access to transportation, off-farm services, and so forth. So they can become very valuable. Remember I mentioned a 500-hectare Mississippi rice farmer. That could be a millionaire many times over, much wealthier family than mine, for example. An average American farmer is much wealthier than I am. But they're still family enterprises. And what we see is across time and space, farms adjust to have just enough land to sustain the family at the prevailing living standard. So in South Korea, they would have a small rice farm, but very high productivity. In Australia, maybe low yields because there's very little rain, but they have a lot of acres. In Mississippi, you have to be quite rich. In Mali, quite poor, but they're producing the same cotton, the exact same product, or say, rice. It could be the same product, just very different sizes of farms with different technologies. So this pattern of family farming is not for lack of trying to make non-family farming. So I have a few hobbies in life. My wife is distressed that all of my hobbies have to do with food and agriculture. But one of them is just to take pictures of ex-corporate farms, ex-plantation farms, farms that were tempted to make a large-scale farm, and I laugh at their bankruptcy. I find it very funny because when they came to build this magnificent cocoa plantation in Sao Tome, they thought they were very clever. So these happened to be Portuguese colonialists coming with money from the metropole, from Portugal, and they felt that they could do in this case, coffee, much better than the local Sao Tomeans could. And they had straight rows. There's a railroad. You can just barely see the line to move the coffee around. They put everyone in rows. They had very high tech for the era. This is early 20th century. And of course, it's completely bankrupt now. Of course, in retrospect, completely bankrupt now. Essentially, all coffee is grown by smallholders growing it for themselves. There are some exceptions, but in the main, more than 90% of world coffee is grown by smallholders, not plantations like this. So whether it's a plantation that was built by colonialists or a corporate farm built by private investors today, I'm sure you're familiar with the land grab corporate farms. They've either gone bankrupt or they will soon go bankrupt. The only exceptions are tea, sugar, oil palm is an exception, and then livestock like poultry can be done with many thousands of chicks. Dairy could be done with many hundreds, even more than 1,000 cows and so forth. And then horticulture is often done. There are definitely many, many variants of ways of owning and managing land and ways of owning and managing labor, and also ways of obtaining loans and gifts and grants and informal safety nets for risk sharing that get formed. So let's take each of those just quickly in turn. A little bit about land ownership. So, I don't know, Daniel, if you want to share from Ghana or other places, who owns the land?
It is embedded in the cultural system such that it becomes difficult for even the head of family to alienate land. Having said that, gradually within the urban settings, there is an upsurge of land markets, but that is only within certain parts of areas where there's pressure for housing and those things. But in the typical communities where agriculture is done, lands are owned by families, and it is difficult to sell land. So you see somebody going to see the head of family, and then just by mutual agreement, says, okay, you can farm this, and then at the end of the season, you pay, like you said, you pay a bag of maize, or you pay a certain value of the produce. That is informal. Okay. There have also been situations where you can rent land for farming, especially in the savanna areas. You can rent land for a certain fee, but those parts of renting land and leasing land are not as overwhelming as those that are in the informal sector, where it is the head of the household or the head of the family that within the family system would allow somebody to farm a piece of land.
In Southern Africa, people speak of ganyu labor, where you form a group with your neighbors and all go together to do hoeing and weeding and so forth. And similarly with loans and insurance, people would rely on their cousins, perhaps a cousin in town, that sort of thing. So we have about 15 minutes, I think, before lunch to get into this economics of it. I want to frame that just with a couple more pictures of situation. One is to remember that farmers everywhere do other things. In the poorest countries, they're doing very labor-intensive things like this. Then when you get to richer countries, farm families invest their money and start other businesses. So a typical farm family will also own or invest in other types of businesses. But everywhere, the farm part of their livelihoods are really intimately tied to what is naturally available in the place where they grew up. So farmers are people who are in a family, they were born to that place, or they moved recently to that area, and what they do is really dependent on that natural thing. Whereas the other business that they're involved in may be more the same everywhere. The brick making, the thatching of roofs, that would be similar in every different place, but the farm part of it would be unique. Here's the basic diagram for an individual household's production. What this does is to take the infinite dimensioned world, the round world, a very complicated world that goes down to up in a bottom to top in a UNICEF framework, left to right in causal pathways, round and around in system dynamics. For us, we do it this way. On the x-axis, we put one thing we're really interested in. In this case, the quantity of nutritious foods. Ground nuts was the example you saw before, but it could be fruits and vegetables or eggs, something like that. On the vertical axis, you put other things that the farm household might be choosing between. And if the farm household has no choice, then the economist would say, we're not very interested. We don't have anything to say about that because we're a study of choice. We're a study of behavior. We're a study of options. We want to predict and evaluate options. If there are no options, we have nothing to say about it. So this would be the other things that the family would be choosing between. So if it was groundnuts or millet, chickens and eggs or maize, dairy and milk or potatoes, for example. And what we would do is ask, as Daniel said at the outset, holding all else constant, just for a given choice, if they were to produce only this thing, they would produce that much of it. So if it's a very poor family, this is a small number. A very low income, very poor family in, say, Tamale region, around Tamale in Ghana, they might be able to produce 1.5 tons of groundnuts, something like that. If they devoted all of their life to only groundnuts, they could produce perhaps that much. If they did no groundnuts at all, so this is 0, and they only do the other thing, they could produce that much. And there's some wavy line in between if they were to go from one to the other. They could have give up a little bit of this and get some more of this, a little bit of that and get some more of that, a little bit of this and get some more. So the slope of this line varies along the curve. Sometimes it bows out, sometimes it bows in. And of course we have names and mathematics behind all of this, but the basic insight is just that as you trade off from producing one thing to the thing that we as nutrition or ANH type researchers are interested in, there'll be some opportunities to trade off in production in that choice to make more. And again, if there's no choice, you want some other department, some other type of study, because economists are studying choice and behavior. So when we are asking why would they produce where along here they produce, what would explain why they produce maybe only this or only that or something in between? Where would they stop? You could have downloaded the slides or downloaded the reading beforehand or seen from other economics. Why would they produce here or here or here or here or here, or indeed perhaps here or there. What are we likely to see as a combination of nutritious foods and other goods that this household might have chosen if we're going to predict, or possibly explain what they did do? So from a prediction point of view, where would you predict they would choose to be if this is all the possibilities that they can do? Could it be out here? If it's out here, that's impossible because given the land and labor they have, this is the frontier of what is possible. More of both is not possible. What about back here? We would think you're gesturing because you don't think they would produce back here. Because they can.
They can, but it's underachievement.
But it would be underachieving. If your spouse did that and came home at the end of the year and said, this is how much I made, you would say, you know, that's ridiculous. You could have done better. You could have made more of both, right? So you would think that was disappointing and you would try to change what you did to get up to the frontier, to be as good as your neighbors, as good as other farmers in producing the two things. So we would expect that the production of the two things is going to be driven by something that would lead people to choose where along this line. Why would we expect someone to produce only here? If they really, really love it, right, it would have something to do with their preferences. If circumstances get worse, this would be their production possibility frontier, so they'd have to choose along that. So something to do with preferences would lead people to choose along here, and we draw preferences as a curved shape here, and there would be an infinite number of these preference curves. The name of these curves is an indifference curve, so that if circumstances are worse, their indifference curve would be back here at a worse level. This is worse, and it allows us to go from prediction to evaluation because we know this is worse because these two things are desirable things by definition, and having more of them is better. So this indifference curve would have multiple slopes here along it, and people have chosen to get to the highest one. What about this household's neighbors? What about other people? How do we bring them into this picture? Right? So this is the chosen point if this household were all by itself. Can we bring neighbors into the picture? So neighbors could influence your ability to produce. Neighbors will also have some ability to trade with you, some interest in buying the thing you offer. So we have a line here whose slope is given by prices because it's given by the relative value that others will place on this thing when they come to you and buy and sell. And that line would have exactly the same slope as the production possibilities frontier at the self-sufficiency point, only by extreme coincidence. If every household was identical, I would not want to exchange with them. But in this context, what is the slope of this price line? It's the amount of other goods, the rise, that you get for any unit of nutritious foods. So in this diagram, the household's neighbors, the society in purple, remember agriculture is in blue, consumption and nutrition is in red, and social interactions are in purple. How much other things are they willing to give for nutritious foods here? That slope is steeper or flatter than the slope of the blue line at the black dot. The slope of the purple line, is it steeper or flatter? Steeper, meaning that other people are willing to give you more other goods per unit of nutritious foods than you yourself have in your own trade-offs. So if this is what other people are willing to do for you, is it possible for this household now to attain a higher standard of living, to get more of both? How would they do that? What would they do? This is what economists would call unsustainable. Why is it unsustainable? Why is it not our prediction for an outcome? We do not think this is going to remain the case for very long. Why? What would people do instead of choosing the black dot? If others are willing to pay you a lot of, or sell to you, a lot of other things for 1 unit of nutritious foods, in other words, a steep rise over run, steeper than your own in self-sufficiency, what would you expect this household to do? How will they change their production to have more of both things, perhaps? They would increase production of nutritious foods. They move along their blue production possibilities frontier to get more nutritious foods and produce less of the other foods because others value those. So they would go to here and produce more of the nutritious foods, produce less of the non-nutritious foods. That would lead to this level of production if they had market access to produce more eggs, more fish was the example that was just given, or perhaps milk or vegetables. But then what would they do in trading with others? How would they take advantage of the fact that others are willing to sell to them a lot of other goods for each unit of nutritious foods? They would, having produced this, be able to get to a higher level of indifference, a higher level of consumption of both things, in this case, going up to here. But this curve could have many different shapes depending on remember we just talked about the shape of this indifference curve. What determines what people's desire for one thing or another? Their budget, which is this line, how much they can afford, and the curve comes from their preferences, what they like. So a household that really likes nutritious foods could have a red dashed curve that's here, where they produce more of this, but they consume more of both. Can you see that you could achieve consumption of more of both right there? So the economist's model of individual choice is one in which we explain their production and consumption with this kind of diagram. And in this case, it's a household that's a net seller. So here's that same household again, but now their neighbors tell them, oh no, we don't want nutritious foods. We have a small rise over run, meaning that we aren't willing to pay a lot of other things for nutritious foods. In that context, this household would switch to produce more of the other, and their consumption might be here instead. So this would be the exact same production, the exact same preferences, but the prices that they face are different, and now they're a net buyer of nutritious foods. So as you think about the farm surveys you might have done, your own relatives, your neighbors and communities, if you live in and work in rural areas, whether there are some households that are net sellers of nutritious foods, some households that are net buyers of nutritious foods. How many of you have ever met someone who's completely self-sufficient, who's just like this? There aren't any. We've never seen them. They don't exist. And they haven't existed for thousands of years. Because why would you? Everyone has neighbors. Everyone's neighbors are a little different from them, and it's always desirable to either be a net seller or a net buyer. And the real punchline of this, the reason why we do this logic, is to discover this fact. This fact is called separability. It's a fact of logic, right, which is a prediction about outcomes which does get successfully confirmed in many hypothesis tests. The prediction is that there will be this thing we call separability, which is that whenever a household or a place is actively selling or buying, production, the blue, is separated from consumption, the red, by market prices and incomes. Separability means that I choose where to produce even before I know where I'm going to consume. I will go to a community in Africa. I've started working a little bit in Asia, very, very little, or all across North America, Europe, and you'll find dairy farmers, vegetable farmers, and they will produce pretty similar production choices. Even if one of them is lactose intolerant and never drinks milk, one of them just really doesn't like eggs, but they still have chickens. One of them has apple trees and loves apples. Another one has apple trees, but they don't really like apples very much at all. Because it turns out that production is separable from consumption. We expect to see zero correlation between own production and consumption. You don't need to know consumption to know production. This is why, for a very long time, people have done agriculture surveys without bothering to measure dietary intake. Because you don't need it, because it does not, it's separable, you don't need it. When I did 2 years of farm surveys in Zimbabwe for my dissertation. I did the enumerator training, I got in the car, I went to visit people, spent hours and hours, and when I looked back on the survey questionnaire, I was stunned that we did not ask people what they ate. We just didn't, because it was 1988, 89, and 1990, and nobody really cared about dietary intakes at that time. Fast forward to now, and we're primarily concerned with dietary intake, but separability still holds. Only when the household or the region is actively selling or buying. So if you're at a period of time or a place where people aren't, and this is especially true for what? For big moisture-intensive vegetables, right? Green leafy vegetables, perishables, those, there might be a village which really doesn't have very much trade in that. If there's local production, people would consume a lot of it because the price would be low, and so forth. It's also true for fluid milk, and it's also true for eggs, actually. Eggs don't get carried very far. They do get traded, but not very far. In contrast, cereal grains, leguminous grains like groundnuts, those would be traded very actively just about everywhere. So we need to understand this to make these predictions. This point about separability is Econ 101. Sometimes it is separable, sometimes it isn't separable. That's what you want to know. If it is separable, if the household is separable in its production choices, I can predict production without needing to know consumption, but I do need to know income and prices to know where they choose to consume, and preferences make a huge difference. If I change my mind, I will consume somewhere else along the purple dashed line here, because this curve would have a different shape if my preferences are different. This happens to be a photograph from Zambia, where a seller of hybrid maize here. There's also lots of farm equipment being sold at this particular agro dealer. Farmers have come. They're selling bicycles as well. And these agro dealers are businesses like any other, so we call them agribusinesses. They link very closely to what's happening in town, of course, in the city, with other kinds of businesses. And what's really central to sort of keep in mind as we go break for lunch is that you have those family farms that are connected to all these agribusiness input suppliers and connected to all these buyers that are food. But these are not family operations. These are companies with shareholders and scale economies and many employees. So you typically have one seed company selling to hundreds or thousands of farms. There's only 4 big fertilizer manufacturers in the whole world, and so forth. And then food industries, you have some giants like Unilever, and then you have local big food companies in every country. And there are those exceptions for the family farms. But the key thing that I want to leave us with is the question of, to what degree does public sector activity, the kinds of things we're debating in government-funded programs and philanthropically funded programs, to what degree do they provide the input suppliers with what they need? The private sector, to what degree is it responding to make copies of the seeds, to multiply the seeds, to scale up and sell? To what degree are food standards and regulations serving this? To what degree are companies providing the processing and distribution around the family farms? So we're going to do the familiar supply-demand diagram that comes from the interaction of all the individual choices as we look at whether society is in fact serving the family farms in the way that would allow them to get the highest level of consumption, especially of that nutritious food that we've put on the horizontal axis that we're interested in as ANH researchers.
Government provides subsidies for these, our agro input dealers, fertilizers, to supply to our farmers. So government plays a major role. Seed multiplication is also government controlled. Few private sector activities into seed multiplication. So we have R&D provided by the public sector. Then we also have the private sector activity like seed multiplication and sales. And then we have downstream, we have organizations that are providing food standards and regulations. And then we also have food processing and distribution. So we have the individual decisions that are made that translates as we add up into communities, into villages, into towns. So gradually, there is that economies of scale that allows agribusinesses to flourish. So the next slides, we're going to move into the economics as to how we present this. Remember our world. Our world is a two-dimensional, but it's powerful that allows us to get insights into the behavior of these things. So I'm going to invite Will.
Remember, along the production possibilities frontier, when the prices of nutritious foods got higher, each individual family switched to producing more of the nutritious food. You remember there was a curve like this, and as the line got steeper, meaning a higher rise over run, a larger quantity of the other food, and that quantity of other food, when we added up all the things you could buy with money, is the price, the value in terms of what other people will give you in exchange for 1 unit of nutritious foods. So we can map each individual's choice as a quantity of the nutritious food and add those up over all the individuals in a given place. And we call this thing a supply curve. It could be for a region like a district, or it could be a village, or it could be a whole country, or all of Africa, or the world as a whole. And each individual's increased production when price goes up means a larger quantity at a higher price. So at low prices, when along that PPF, the price ratio is flat, and so they produce little, you would have a small quantity. And then when the price ratio gets steeper, each individual produces more, and we add up all the individuals. And you can see that each individual's supply curve must be upward sloping. And so when we add up all the people, we get a single upward sloping supply curve. So this blue line represents all of nature and technology, all of agricultural production, everyone's farming activities added up over a village, a district, a region, a country, whatever it may be. So we would need a label here that says this is the supply and we're going to have demand supply curve for this village or this district in this year or this season. The red line is all the people's indifference curves meeting those income and price lines, defining what they're able and choose to consume. At higher prices, consume less. At lower prices, consume more. Why is this dot our predicted outcome of the two? Why not some other dot? Other than the aesthetics, and it's very important not to be fooled by the math or the geometry to say, oh, this is the pretty dot where they two cross. Why not this point here, this quantity here? So imagine this is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 kgs per year in a village. Say it's 10,000 kgs per year of milk in a given village. why not 5,000 here? If this is 10,000, what would happen at 5,000? This is the demand, and this is the supply. Would this be a predicted outcome at 5,000? Why not? These people would do what? They would demand, in a sense, they would be willing to pay, they would have income and desire, income and their indifference curve, they would be willing to pay more than it costs these people to provide. And so they would say to someone, please, can you please feed a cow a little bit more, milk a cow a little bit more, add another cow and have some more milk. And some farmers would say, okay, we can do that. So you would have a demand above supply and people would choose to produce more. But why not say 20? Why not more quantity than this 10? 5 is not an outcome we would predict to sustain very long because demand is above supply. Why not 15, say, over here, which would be, why would a 15 not be something we would expect to see survive? If we make a prediction, we expect it to be here. Why not here? At this level of quantity, production costs more than people are willing to pay. And the central insight of economics is captured here, for societal outcomes, is captured here in that each of these costs is the cost for one more. Economists call it the marginal one. So the incremental cost of each additional unit goes up, just as the incremental value to consumers of each unit goes down, and people stop where the two meet. So we only focus on that one marginal one to make our prediction. This is the predicted outcome because the marginal cost, the incremental cost of the incremental unit along the supply curve. So we're not interested in the average. An easy way to tell the difference between an economist and a non-economist will speak of the average. What's the average emissions from all milk? The average climate change, carbon emissions from all milk. What is the average consumption of something? Economists are interested in the marginal one, just the incremental. So if you stop eating meat, for example, the animal that you won't consume is not the average one. It's a marginal one. And so we'd ask, what is the marginal effect, meaning the last one? So this is a prediction that is quite specific to economics because it's based on the marginal cost of production along supply curve, marginal cost of demand. What's important about this framework is it allows us to think about what happens when this community encounters a rest of the world. So whether this is a village or a district or a country or all of Africa, it has neighbors. And those neighbors, just like the individual case from before lunch, are not going to be the same as the village, the district, the country, or indeed all of Africa. So the rest of the world will be willing to pay or able to sell at a price which is not the same as this price here. So in the case where the rest of the world has a high price for it, you produce here and consume here. Why? Because the marginal unit of consumption along the demand curve is at that price level, this quantity, and at that price level, this quantity of production. So in this case, they're exporting this thing. So what are some nutritious things that Africa exports? Well, there's cocoa, coffee, oil. Africa's a big exporter of oil. I'm sorry, I'm not hearing. Nuts. Nuts, yes. Tree nuts, cashews, and also ground nuts. And also some staples, sorry?
Plantain.
Plantain, banana? Yeah, so there would be some things that are like a staple like that. And then, of course, there are other things that the rest of the world offers a low price for. So what are some things like that for Africa as a whole? What are some things for which the rest of the world is like, we have a lot of that, and Africa's like, sell me some of that, because my demand is higher at a larger quantity than the production within Africa. So this would be rice, wheat, of course, but even maize. So why would the rest of the world have a low price for this thing? Well, rice, heavily irrigated. Africa has very little moisture. Asia and North America have lots of water. Corn, maize production is much, much more technically advanced in terms of the hybrids and so forth that are used in South America or North America. Wheat is reliant on some irrigation, but also lots of technology. So that it'd be very cheap to produce in other places, but not in Africa, similarly here. So what we have is a model, an analytical framework that is just the same in some sense as the UNICEF framework or causal pathways or system dynamics models. It just looks like this instead, where individuals are doing this and a village or district or society is doing, it looks like that, where at the time of self-sufficiency we would expect this, but at a time of when your neighbor is different from you and you can exchange with them, we would expect people to be buying and selling. And even the most remote communities would look like this, and the most remote individuals would look like this, at least some of the time during certain seasons or for certain foods, there would be separability. So right from the beginning, economists who in the 18th century with Adam Smith and then formalized we were thinking of agriculture-nutrition linkages in terms of this idea of separability, where food systems defined as the off-farm community in which you experience your food environment, driving production choices in the blue and relating production to consumption, and hence the nutrition outcome or the health outcome. So there's some very surprising predictions that this framework leads to that we can do hypothesis tests on and ask, is this model valid? Does this model accurately predict observed outcomes? So I'll just give you some examples of that. So the first example is that this test of separability, would it be true that the local prices are set by opportunities to trade with others? So when we had the original motivation, which was the groundnut prices that are highest in the far north of Ghana and also the south on the coast and lowest in the middle, the difference is transportation cost. And if transportation cost went down so that transport was easier, the price difference would become smaller. The price level might stay the same, but the price difference would become smaller. So we're predicting that we would observe this kind of pattern of response to the price at the border driving price of, say, groundnuts in Ghana. And this prediction is borne out time and time again. We find this happening in every society for every food, where it's price at the border that then drives how much is consumed and how much is produced for most products most of the time. What we actually observe governments doing is restricting trade to some degree. And governments do this because it allows them to meet the needs of political lobbying and interest groups in a convenient way. They can restrict the trade in exports to reduce local prices and help consumers who use that thing consume more of it. And they can restrict imports to raise local prices and allow producers of that thing to produce more of it. So we predict and observe governments doing this trade restriction very, very often when there's a political lobbying or politically mobilized interest group that wants to see this. So what are some examples of restricted exports? The one I worked on most recently was, did a big study of groundnut restriction of exports in Senegal. And you would see the same thing. Cashews in Mozambique, somebody mentioned cashews, are restricted, have long been restricted in exports. So why would the government of Senegal restrict exports of groundnuts, peanuts, to allow the demanders to have them at lower price? Is that households consuming it who are lobbying? Who would lobby, who would go to government and say, you must restrict the export of groundnuts so we can have it at a cheaper price? The oil companies. The oil companies with the suits and the ties and the very sharp money, they are like money, 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 money on politics to insist that they have that restriction on the exports. And they are very, very wealthy as a result of that, as a result of restricting exports. What are some examples of restricting imports to raise local price? Poultry in many African countries, and that would, of course, be potentially harmful on nutrition. And who would be lobbying for that? Who would go to government with a suit and a tie and nice shoes and say, please, could you do this for us?
The domestic producers.
So that's an industry which is typically has some scale economies, right? It's hard to do just a few chickens. Commercially, you can have hundreds and hundreds of chickens, and so you would have that kind of lobbying. So we also have other kinds of government intervention, of course, but these two are the oldest and most famous. This is what Adam Smith was arguing against in the 18th century, why he wrote The Wealth of Nations, was because of a policy like this one, where this supply curve was fundamentally about the landowners in the aristocratic British landowners who wanted to keep the price of wheat high so they could have higher rents for their land. So for ag nutrition linkages, the fundamental surprise is this one, that when we have interventions that boost production, what do you think they'll do to consumption in a place that's exporting? So imagine I have a village which is growing some groundnuts in central Ghana, and I can improve productivity of groundnuts. How will that change this diagram? What's going to happen to those added groundnuts? They're going to continue to be exported. They'll just have more exports. And the amount of consumption change is exactly zero. Our prediction is no effect at all on consumption. Similarly, interventions that boost consumption might have no effect at all on production. They might simply lead to an increase in imports. This is the idea of separability, that as long as there is active trade in something, production is separate from consumption by the amount of trade, and a policy that changes demand has no effect on production, and a policy that changes supply has no effect on consumption. This is the fundamental result of active trading, which economists have tested time and again, and we find it to be very consistently robust prediction. It holds out. Now, it's not always true, because separability is not always true, because there are often seasons or times when you can't trade, when there isn't trade. So if you are doing a study of, say, home gardens, and you find home gardening is producing a harvest at a time when people cannot buy, that will change consumption. But if you find that it's producing more vegetables at a time when people are bringing vegetables into that village, then it will just reduce the amount that's brought in instead of increasing the amount that's consumed. Could still be a good thing, but only if producing vegetables is profitable at those prices. So services are things that are always self-sufficient. So they're always non-tradable. So what do you think of this result? The degree to which this is surprising, the degree to which it's convincing, the degree to which it makes sense of the world. What we're looking for here are scientific discoveries in the sense of an aha moment from a discipline where astronomy explains the patterns of stars in the sky, or the germ theory of disease explains. To what degree does economics explain something here that you're like, oh, that's cool. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. I hadn't thought about it like that, but this is true.
One of the things that a lot of people have been working on is if we promote milk production at the household level, the children in the house or the family will drink more. And indeed, many of the studies show that it was not the case.
So this explanation begins with the thing we think about as important here, which is the quantity of nutritious foods from 0 to 1, 2, 3, or however much. And then this is the quantity of other from 0 to 1, 2, 3, and holding everything else constant in their life, the amount of land, the amount of fishing boats, the amount of cows that they could have. If they put all of it into the nutritious food, they could do that. If they put all of it into other food, they could do this. If they started with all other and they took a little bit, they wanted to have some fishing, for example, or some dairy, they might have to, if they want to do some dairy, for example, they could go to a neighbor and offer to do some work for them, and they would give up a certain amount of other things to get a little bit of dairy. But the point about both dairy and fish is that if they give up a lot of other things, they can jump out to a lot of fish or a lot of dairy, because they could have a whole cow or 2 cows or a whole boat or a big boat. And so what you would see is a production possibilities frontier that's going to look like that, and, or actually even further out might go like that, something like that. So then we would ask, well, where along this curve would they want to be? What determined the point along the production frontier that people would choose to be? If I'm doing cows, say this is milk, where would I stop making milk? Would I go all the way to make only milk? In the US, you might see a farmer who does only milk. But in Ethiopia, they would focus on milk, but they would also do some other things. Similarly for the fish family with fishing. And what would determine where along this they would go? What did we need to use 2 hours ago to tell us? We need the market, we need other people telling us what, if it was just themselves, by themselves, it would be indifference curves. So there would be a preference, say a very poor person who can't consume very much of both might be willing to have a lot of other or willing to have a lot of milk, but never go, and they would have a curve of their preferences. It could be it's not always a smooth curve. And there would be other ones of these preferences like this. And they can't get to this high level because this is their production possibilities frontier. This is the limit of what they can produce. But other people, so this would be in self-sufficiency. But when other people come along for your fishing village or that dairying community, what is other people's relative valuation of milk or fish compared to this household? It's other people, do they like it more than this household does or less? They like it more. They're willing to pay a lot of other. So the rise over run is steep for other people, and they can get to a higher level of, so these are all higher levels of income or revenue or budget. So what's the highest one they can reach? I keep going out until I get to one that just touches once here. This is not possible because it's above their production possibility frontier. But this is possible. Involves producing a little more than that and allows them to get to a higher level of indifference than this. So I need a dashed indifference curve that's above this one. This is my previous one. my previous indifference curve, the new indifference curve they can reach is more. So imagine if this household really, really loves milk or loves fish. This might be their indifference curve. And they would go here. So this is self-sufficiency, remember? And they could use the market to buy more of both. That would be a household that responds to the market by being a bit more specialized in this thing that the market likes, that other people like, and they use it to buy more of both. This rise over run is the amount that they sell of the nutritious food and buy of the other things. But you could also imagine a fisherman who just doesn't like fish. And their budget constraint here might be such that they would choose to sell a lot of fish and go all the way back to here. Or if they decide they don't like milk, go all the way back to here. So whether they're here or here is a matter of preferences. So this change from this to this would be the subject of a behavior change campaign. Advertisements, radio plays, billboards, house-to-house visits, community health volunteers, women's groups or adolescent girl groups or boy groups or husbands groups or parents groups, whatever you want to do, grandparent programs. That would be about changing people's minds, meaning altering their preferences. Conditional cash transfers or unconditional cash transfers, safety nets, those would be about just giving people more money but not changing prices. A road building or market development program that would change prices would alter the slopes of the lines. The slope of this, the rise over the run, the amount of other goods you have to give up to get one. And a production program would alter the PPF. So a dairy development or a fisheries development program would not change this, but would shift this out. And a drought in a dairy area that would reduce feed would shift this back. So you can see how our conceptual framework, our model, allows us to distinguish between production in the blue, consumption in the red, and the market or safety net programs and prices in the purple, the slope of the line, the level of the line. And that level of the line is the budget constraint, whose slope is prices and whose level is the level of income. So implied in this would be a price line that would be about that slope. So if the market has a slope that's much higher, like this, then their income is much higher in the sense that they can reach up to a higher level of indifference. So they're richer. And imagine that they really, really like this thing, if this is quantity of fish. They could actually spend all of this additional money just on eating more fish. But they could also spend all this additional money just on eating more of other. That would depend on your behavior change communication program, your preferences. Is that? So what we have is a framework that allows us to put agriculture nutrition linkages in a logical, scientific, in the sense that a scientific framework in the sense that it allows us to make some predictions, to test those predictions, and to interpret whether people are better off or worse off as a result of that specific change, where we're linking the individual with the community in a specific way. It is true that in some cases there's no markets. In other cases, people would be a net buyer of the interesting thing or a net seller of the thing that we're interested in. So to apply this framework to different contexts and issues, we've prepared some example applications. But we can certainly take this conversation in lots of different directions, where, as we had from the outset, the very beginning of this discussion, the idea that in red, the consumer choices and nutrition and health outcomes are related to their underlying, if you will, agricultural causes and their social determinants of health in terms of the relative cost of different things, allow us to think about this circular causality, and where there might be some quasi-random, sort of natural experiment like good weather that would shift production, or a abrupt change in preferences that would alter the indifference curves, or an abrupt shift in prices that would alter markets and policy. And those natural experiments would allow us to see these causal relationships. So remember, this is holding all else constant. And remember that farm families start needing to feed themselves, having moved out to the land that they could have access to, which would be the worst, the poorest people in the worst environments, because they were the last to arrive and relegated to the least attractive places. And we would expect everything to be poor in those places. And in contrast, a more affluent location, everything would be nicer. So we would expect better health and better education and better transport and also better agricultural technologies, because people would invest their opportunity, their wealth, their purchasing power, their capabilities. So we would expect everything to be good in good places, everything to be worse in worse places, and it would be only incremental changes around that we would be able to observe when there's a natural experiment. Colonial governments did very, very little for child survival. Suddenly, child survival became something that national governments were interested in doing, and you had a child survival baby boom. Fertility rates did not go up, the same number of pregnancies per woman, but a very rapid increase in child survival led to this population explosion in the black line here that will eventually flatten out, but not for a long time. Meanwhile, in 1950, when the world as a whole was about 1/4 urban, Africa was what? Teeny tiny towns. In the 1950s, you would go to a famous town. I don't know how big Accra was in 1950, but it was a famous place. It was full of great intellectuals and so forth, but it was a very small town. Why? Because the British would not have invested particularly in making Accra a big city with lots of things. It wanted an administrative capital to do administration so that they could export cocoa and coffee and so forth and import other things. They wouldn't want to build the cities. So African cities were very, very small. African cities were famous, important centers of culture and administration, but they had no industry, they had no, because of colonial. And so after decolonization, you have African cities growing in this period faster than cities growing anywhere else in the world. So African cities are growing at 6, 9, 12% a year. This is true for secondary towns and cities as well as the big capital cities of Africa. But their annual growth, because they're so small, is not nearly enough to absorb that increment of child survival and its consequences. And so the rural population is the red line, continues to grow for many, many years. Africa as a whole will get to 50% urban in 2040. 50% urban in 2040, and the rural will continue to grow. So African farm sizes will continue to shrink for not just one generation to people's children, but people's grandchildren. African farms will continue to shrink on average. African farms will continue to shrink on average, not to my children, but to my grandchildren. Now, this is not true everywhere. So in particular, this is Ghana. What do you see? 1950s, Accra was a small city. Population growth accelerated with the introduction of public health programs. Ghana was exceptional partly in that it was the first of the first independence in 1957. 57, yes. And of course, Ghana had this extraordinary period of intellectual activity and socialist government and so forth, and then very, very famous structural reforms in the early 1980s, which, unlike other structural reforms across Africa, were persistent and stayed reformed. As a result of which, the urbanization of Ghana went much faster than urbanization in other parts of the continent, and did so in a very sustainable way, a very organic way of industrialization and growth happening much faster. As a result of which, Ghana is actually estimated to have been 20% urban 10 years ago. Way, way, way earlier than the rest of Africa. And the peak is just before 2050, but it's not rising, the rural is not rising very fast. As a result of which, Ghana, unusually, is having very, very low rural population growth. Very little shrinkage of farm size in Ghana. So it doesn't take much to help Ghanaian farmers improve their living standards by improving productivity per unit of land, because their units of land are not shrinking. In contrast, other parts of Africa, each successive new household has less land than every previous household, and that means that the floor of living standards for the poorest keeps falling because their farm sizes are shrinking. But that's not really happening much in Ghana because of Ghana's successful reforms back in 1982, 83, 84. So if we just focus on the rural, what we see is that the total of the world will peak very soon, total world rural. South Asia is soon to peak and doing decline. If we did East Asia, we would see rapid decline already now and increasing farm sizes in East Asia, and Africa is continuing to grow like that. So this putting together this demography and rural-urban linkages back to our individual household decision-making and the markets should give us quite a lot of insight. How many of you have heard of Hello Tractor in Nigeria? How many customers is Hello Tractor going to get? I would not invest in Hello Tractor. Why? Because in Nigeria, farm sizes are shrinking. Nobody wants to take over their neighbor's land. Now, there are people who are a military officer, an urban bureaucrat or businessman, and they might go back to their village and say, and I want to farm all this, and I'm going to use Hello Tractor to farm all of this, and the rest of you can go find your land elsewhere, or actually be landless. And then that would just push down the floor of living standards of those elsewhere who have the smaller land. So it is possible to have mechanization, and we do see mechanization prematurely in the sense of before the rural population begins to fall. Premature mechanization is what you saw in South America with latifundia, big farms, and minifundia, small farms, because the military conquest of South America took the same form that it took in southern Africa, where the military conquerors chose to settle and chose to farm very large and force the small holders into very, very small parcels. But it is an interesting point about whether, when outmigration occurs, is it worth even continuing to farm that land? So it turns out that there's relatively little parts of world agriculture that have ever been abandoned. It does happen, but most places that have ever been plowed are still being plowed. Relatively few places are abandoned. One place that has been abandoned, I know it very well, is where I grew up in New Hampshire in the United States, in New England, in the northeastern United States, because soils are very rocky. And so it's cold in the winter, warm in the summer, and rocks come up out of the ground. And so people did plow that land in the 18th century with horses and donkeys, and they would go through and they would pick up but as soon as people could move to the Midwest, they abandoned that farmland and it was forest. So that's one of the few parts of the world where farmland is abandoned. There are, of course, other examples. Nepal would be one, where people just are much better off working outside. It's such terrible soil. It's so remote. I mean, it's really awful. You wouldn't want to have to farm there. This linkage between the rural floor and the urban floor, a lot of migration is rural to rural as people move from one district to another with marriage or family connections, and sometimes even just acquaintances or opportunities to move. And then rural to urban seasonally, and circular migration where people do exploratory migration, see if they can survive in a town, try to go to another town. And then, of course, some people do end up finding an opportunity to work in the city and provision it and move back and forth with whatever's being carried on top of this. And we have this model that helps to explain the kind of phenomena we see in a unified framework. So I hope that's a helpful lens through which to see the world, where individual choices in this framework and market outcomes in this framework give us a set of hypotheses to frame research, a set of policy predictions to sort of guide intervention. And coming back to our motivation, an understanding that this was a net selling surplus area. This is a net selling buying area. The difference between these two prices is just the cost of transport. So at any given time, if you had nothing better to do, you could go and stand on the road here and count the trucks, and you would see that there's more traveling this way than that way of carrying groundnuts, carrying peanuts. And if you computed the cost of transport, you would see that the difference in price is the cost of transportation. So if I do more planting of groundnuts up here, that would reduce the amount that's imported, but probably not change consumption. And if I increased consumption here, that would reduce the amount they export, but probably not change production because of separability. And peanuts would also be going in this direction. So we have, in addition to transportation, an important insight about storage and time. After transport is storage, where the key thing about most but not all crops is this idea of a simultaneous harvest across a whole area. So not everything is like this, but many, many things. You know, all of the tomatoes are roughly the same time. All of the, of course, cereal grains, leguminous grains, and so forth. What determines the gradient here, the rise? How much do you need to get paid more for your rice each month? You need to get paid the value of storage, the value of keeping your money or your income in the bin as opposed to using it for something else. What do we call the value of money, keeping it in the bin as opposed to using it for something else? It's an interest rate. It's the cost of capital. It's the amount that you have to pay someone to lend you to put your money in storage, to put your value in storage. So we would expect prices to rise by the interest rate. In a very, very poor place, interest rates are really high. And so this gradient is very, very high. It's even higher because of uncertainty and other factors that would make this gradient super, super high. So the gradient reflects the cost of holding stocks, and then the level depends on the amount of harvest, the amount that's left, and so forth. We would expect that to rise and fall, and we would expect trade to make a big difference. So this is real prices in Addis Ababa for wheat, which here is the import price. Wheat comes into Djibouti, and I've seen the road that goes from Djibouti across, and so it takes a lot of truck transport from the port to get into Addis. So the price in Addis is much higher when you're importing, and if you're exporting, you have to pay transportation to Djibouti. And the world prices you see are here. World prices do have a peak and then a valley, but they fluctuate much less than the local prices. Why? Local prices have local drought. So this is characteristic of just about every cereal grain market in the world, where local prices are fluctuating a lot more than the world prices do. World prices are stable because there's South America and North America, Southern Africa and Northern Hemisphere, and so forth. Different prices behave in very different ways. We want to think a lot about the incentives and the activities of the food processing sector. This is one of my favorite sort of stories about preferences and products, where Daniel and I were able to go out. Daniel was very kindly took me to a shop just to have a look around and see what was being sold. And here's an example of a product. It's called Tom Brown. So the word Tom Brown's an English word, right? And you've seen this in any other countries? Tom Brown? Any other countries? Corn wheat blend, sold locally in Ghana by a local miller for a really low price. Why would Ghanaians do this? There's a wonderful study recently about this phenomenon. So this is soy wheat blend that was used in food aid from the United States to Ghana at the beginning of Ghanaian independence. And people liked it. They liked it. It's delicious. It's actually really good. And local people would be like, let's make some. And let's give it a kind of English schoolboy name because it's kind of associated with, I don't know, foreigners or something. And it stuck. The origins of the exact name, Tom Brown, are not clear, like exactly how it happened. It's not a blockbuster product you would see everyone eating all the time, but it's still here, and it's an example of how what's sold depends on something very specific that gets formed, that isn't an accident. It's an accident of history, but it's not without explanation. It can be very location specific. This is true for Ghana, but not elsewhere. It can change over time, and it's often about the food industry, about processing, and so forth. So I think this is a really good kind of instance of that. So this is sort of the market for fortified infant foods that we're quite interested in. So maybe it's good to kind of close with these slides about how different kinds of workshops and research settings like this ANH Academy meeting allow us to bring the diverse perspectives together where different stakeholders have different interests and give us the different lessons from different models where causal pathways are useful, the UNICEF framework is useful, every type of map is useful for a different purpose, and our particular economics one is useful for specific purposes, including this idea of separability between agriculture and nutrition, which is why ag-nutrition linkages, often there aren't any, but then sometimes there are, and so you want to be able to see where they are and how big they are. And this third takeaway is that of all the disciplines, of all the ways of looking at the world, economics is the one that has the most jobs in sort of public service and government agencies. You know, the World Bank has 10,000 professional staff or so, and of them, I don't know, 8,000 are economists. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but IFPRI, for example, has, I don't know how many professional jobs, and most of those are economists, and on and on. Like, why is that? Well, it's because ag-nutrition linkages economics began with the study of ag-nutrition linkages in the 18th century to study food policy with Adam Smith, and continued to have that as its focus throughout the 20th century. And it gives us this framework with which to think about how, when all the different interest groups come together, you could think about input supply, going to family farms, going to the food system and the processing sector and its nutritional value or lack of nutritional value, which then feeds back to household welfare, and especially in an intergenerational sense over time. So that's what we have for you. I hope this has been a good use of the Learning Lab opportunity. Thank you so much for joining.